Dear beautiful souls, today I would like to address a topic that is of great significance for all of you, and many of you will already have felt the effect that have to do with the energies around this topic, and it has to do with the necessity for certain practitioners to leave their family in order to be able to perform proper spiritual practice. And this is for many a challenging one. Not only depending on if you come from a culture where the family is traditionally very, very important and that there's a lot of guilt programming where emotional blackmail happens if you try to do anything other than what the tradition within the family expects of you. But also in the Western hemisphere, if it's not in an Asian hemisphere where the framework is that rigid, but even in the Western hemisphere, the dogmas are more hidden, they're not that obvious. So for example, if you don't pursue a career, if you don't focus on academia, if you say that you actually want to pursue a spiritual life, the dogma is then more of an insanity dogma that people claim, well, if you don't do something that brings you material wealth, or where the focus is material wealth and longevity in terms of material survival, if this is not your focus, then you're crazy. You're not rational. You are an insane human being. Now, your own ego will buy into these type of stories because your ego has been raised with these type of stories. Where, for example, if you are Asian and you're being told, well, if you're not taking care of father and mother right now, then you should feel very, very guilty. Or if you're a Westerner and you're not following, let's say, the dollar, or if you're not seeking to buy a house and pay the mortgage off, because most people can't afford nowadays, actually, if we think about that. But the dogmas are just different, but they still are dogmas that, of course, lead to somewhat of a limitation. So the guilt trap is very important, because we have learned this from the story of the Buddha. So when the Buddha left the palace, and for those who are not familiar with it, so the young prince Siddhartha, when his father realized, oh, I'm going to have a son, he went to a seer, to a Vedic astrologer. And that seer told him, well, your son is either going to be a great saint or a great king. And of course, from the father's perspective, who was a king, who was a man of worldly power, well, he better be into worldly power and he better become a king. So he conjured up a plan where he said, okay, I'm going to keep my son in the palace. I'm not going to let him see old and sick people. I'm not going to let him see worldly suffering. I'm only going to give him pleasures in terms of food and stimulation, in terms of beauty and sexuality and so on, in hope to get him addicted to the worldly attachments, so he would rather prefer to become a king. And of course this gloriously backfired, because in a way, unknowingly, the father was doing the work for the divine unconsciously. Because when Buddha one time left the palace and he suddenly saw all the suffering, he was completely unprepared when he saw paralyzed people on the street, disabled people, leprosy. All of this was kept from him. So the shock to his system was so severe that an awakening actually had to follow. And then he chose, against tradition, he chose to not stay in the idea of worldly power. He chose to not stay in his marriage at the time. And he left his wife and his child because he realized, oh, the family that I'm seeking to aid is greater than my local family karma. And this is something that the majority of you, when you pursue a spiritual life, you will struggle with, because your programming will tell you, oh, my regional family, my now family, my father, mother, my wife, my husband, my children are the most important reality, because that's what you have been programmed to believe. So you need to stay in there. But what happens then, that your compassion is actually limited to your family. Yeah, but what happens, for example, if whatever you do could affect thousands of people, could affect the whole planet? So then compassion, when it becomes truly great, becomes greater than just compassion for one's own family. for one's own individual attachment to the subjectivity of the localized karma. And we have to transcend that. And that is why monks in the past, they had to make a vow of renunciation, live in the monastery and be away from town life. Because in town life, they were in the collective energy field that constantly would, like an immune system, react to them being different and try to reprogram them into a lower state of understanding. Now, of course, on a level of compassion, yes, I clearly understand if you have children, you are not going to abandon your children. And if you are in a good marriage, you're not going to abandon your marriage. However, it depends on your karma in some way. Because those of you who have been on the planet for a long, long time, you at some point begin transcending the local energy fields or the local states of consciousness, and something greater is arising in you. And now the conflict begins between your local subjective self and your higher self, because your higher self feels the mission, feels the duty to serve the whole, not only your localized family. Some of you will be able to strike a balance between that. Some of you will want to go really deep and maybe leave family. There is not really a right or wrong answer with regards to that. However, what I'm trying to point out is the following, that those of us who do not remember their past lives do not really understand that the thought of staying stuck in family has not occurred once. It has occurred hundreds and hundreds of times. Because when you do not have soul memory yet, you do not understand how many husbands you had, or wives you had, or children you had, and how often you have obeyed the parents and followed in the tradition. So there is, because of a lack of memory, because of a soul amnesia, there is the idea that, oh, my current situation is unique, my current situation is special, and I'm a very, very bad son, or a very, very bad husband, or a very, very bad wife, or a very, very bad daughter if I don't obey the current programming. But you might have obeyed the current programming hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So after a few thousand years, you might get tired of that, and you might realize, okay, if I stay in the local karmic field of my family, I actually cannot deepen my spiritual practice, and I cannot be of service in a bigger picture. So at some point, the ego's identification needs to be broken with the sense of special relationships, that your family for some reason is more special than somebody else's family, or that your wife is more important than somebody else's wife, or that your neighbor is not as important as your own feelings and what is going on within yourself. So this idea of special relationship, of like a narrowed down perception, saying that, okay, certain relationships are special, that they deserve my attention, but the totality of humanity or the totality of the animal kingdom, all of that to me is anonymous, and I don't care about that. This is indeed the ego trap, and at some point we need to realize, oh, our family is whole humanity. And at some point we realize our family is all sentient beings, including animals. Yeah, and they're not only on this planet. This might sound a little bit far-reaching. That's all right. However, my point being is simply this, that in a lot of consecutive lifetimes we choose to use guilt in order to trap ourselves in family situations instead of pursuing spiritual goals that would serve the totality. And the reason often why we have done this as souls is because we let our society and our localized family structure, we let them guilt trip us into submission. And because we didn't want to confront them, or we didn't want to speak out, we accepted the roles assigned by society, even though there might have been actually a higher calling that would serve the bigger picture. Now, when you start serving the bigger picture, please understand this. If you would, for example, be a great heart surgeon or a great neurosurgeon, why would you work as a nurse? It does not make sense. So if you, for example, have the potential to be a spiritual facilitator, why would you limit yourself in the acceptance of a field that serves a smaller vision than a greater vision? And often what family will do, if you seek the spiritual life, you will be labeled as selfish. You will be labeled as insane. You will be labeled as somebody who doesn't care about others. But it's actually not you who doesn't care. It is the family who doesn't care. Because the family, for some reason, through some sort of attachment, they have expectation towards you. And they want you to fulfill these expectations. And if you're going on a spiritual quest, their expectations or their desires or needs are not fulfilled. So they are actually egoically attached to their own desires. And in order to have their desires fulfilled, they need to trap you, blackmail you in a guilt way, in a family construct. So they feel safe, so they feel fulfilled, so they have what they need. But then they're actually saying, oh, limit your love to us. Don't love anybody else, because loving anybody else is selfish of you. We want all your energy, we want all your attention, and we want your sacrifice to be for the family, not for the totality of humanity, not for the betterment of the planet, not for the liberation of sentient beings. And at some point, you start looking through that scheme, and then the difficulty becomes, okay, if you truly want to pursue a spiritual path, and if enlightenment is your goal, even though this might seem, again, very far-fetched, very far away from your actual reality that you're currently experiencing. But let's say deep down, there's something in you that knows that this is where you're going. Well, then you need to leave the family construct, because the family construct will not allow you to practice to the depth that you need to complete the practice. Not only that, beings who are unconscious, who are in an egoic state, what will happen is they will channel dark energy. So when you start, for example, meditating and you do certain practice and you are a householder, you're not a renunciate, and you live in your own home, then your family members suddenly start intruding your meditation or starting conflicts with you because they feel the energy increase in you, and the darkness that they carry suddenly gets scared of that and tries to bring your energy frequency down. So they'll try to trigger you, try to get you into conflict, try to make you feel guilty, and all these things. And for a beginner practitioner, this is very, very hard to resist. And therefore, it's better to start in a monastic tradition to actually develop the inner strength and the discipline in an environment that supports you. So then later, when you interact with the world, you don't fall down in frequency. You can actually maintain yourself through presence and through the yogic practices and meditation practices that you then have been integrating into your nervous system. So for those who want advice on the matter, if you're, for example, from an Asian family, let's say Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Korean, and you feel this great family pressure, highly, highly likely in order to succeed in your practice, if your family is not spiritual, you will have to leave the family. And in the Western world, you might even have to leave the Western world, not only your local family, but go somewhere where actually practice is supported in order to succeed. Because if you allow yourself through attachment to be trapped in a localized situation, you cannot evolve. And many of you have allowed yourself to be trapped time and time and time again. Contemplate about this, my friends. Be well.